there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How's that, Scott? Am I over far enough? Sorry, I had to get a phone call, so. Okay, great.
Hey everyone, I'm Michelle Yehi Lee, reporter at the Washington Post and the president of the Asian American Journalists Association. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion on covering politics from the White House to the campaign trail. On behalf of AAJA, I would like to thank CBS for sponsoring today's session and for being such a dedicated supporter of our organization, our mission, and our programs. We're really grateful for your partnership. Thank you to our fantastic speakers, women I admire a lot and whose work I follow very closely. The theme of our gathering this year is visibility, both for our journalists and for our API community. The journalists you're about to hear from have really brought visibility to women journalists and to women of color journalists through their work covering high-profile national news. In this pivotal election year, we're very grateful to have them covering such important matters. And now I would like to welcome Margaret Brennan, the moderator of Face the Nation on CBS, who will be leading our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm excited about today's conversation. As you mentioned, some impressive guests for our conversation about covering politics from the White House to the campaign trail, though everything is political these days. I want to introduce, although they probably don't need introductions, our two guests, Elaine Quijano, who brings to her job at CBS and CBSN a range of experience, including having been a correspondent not just at our network, but before that, a White House correspondent at CNN. She covered the Bush campaign in 2004, and Elaine, you majored in journalism at the University of Illinois. I also want to introduce Weijia Jiang, who I know spoke to all of you yesterday, but will join us today with a new perspective. She is, of course, our White House correspondent at CBS. She joined CBS NewsPath in 2015, covered the Trump campaign in 2016. And one thing I learned about you, Weijia, you in philosophy and minored in chemistry as an undergrad at William & Mary. That's incredible.
I did. Thanks. I thought I was going to go to medical school, and then I took a hard turn and pursued journalism as well. But I think, I think it's helpful to have a background and to have studied something else when you're a journalist, because oftentimes we have to cover so many different types of stories.
I 100% agree with you on that front. I mentioned that both of you are mothers. So you have multiple roles, multiple jobs, and you're good at multitasking is what I think that means. I want to start out with just how our jobs every day has gotten even more complicated in this pandemic. And Elaine, right now, can you explain to our viewers just how you get on air every day?
In paper clips and a small but mighty army at CBSN, that is our 24/7 digital network, who very early on, when it became clear we weren't going back to the broadcast center, dispatched broadcast quality equipment to all of the anchors' homes and basically engaged in these virtual tutorials on how to set things up to prepare us to be able to get back on the air. So basically, I'm standing in what was the dog's room. Actually, this was an area where my dog's cage was right here. And when all of this happened, you know, there is a lot of gear involved for broadcast. We had no place to put it. So this is squeezed in my home studio. This monitor was our living room monitor. And here we are now using it day in and day out for Red and Blue, the politics show that we do Monday through Thursday, rather, at 5 p.m. Eastern. So what we've done is created, as I know they have done on the broadcast side, a virtual newsroom where people basically meet on these Zoom meetings to check out shots, to make sure technically all the ducks are in a row. And we have our editorial meetings via Zoom. We have many, many phone calls throughout the course of the day. And it's really been a learning process, and in many ways feels like the launch of CBSN back in 2014, where we're all having to figure it out as we go. So in a nutshell, again, small but mighty army. I cannot thank them enough, because they are also working under some extremely difficult circumstances, and they continue to do so today.
Because we talk a lot about how the pandemic has changed the campaign or changed the things that people see. They don't see what happens behind the scenes, and TV production is incredibly collaborative. And you rightfully point out there is yeoman's work being done behind the scenes, all our technical staff, and then you, who you just said you had to learn how to do a lot of this yourself. We just like work. Washington, D.C. for CBS never really shut down. And certainly the White House, you step up at the White House, sit in that briefing room. You've traveled with the president. How does that work like covering politics in this pandemic?
It presents a lot of new challenges. As you know, having covered the White House too, it is a real benefit to be on campus every day, to have access, to be able to call up a source and say, hey, I'm here. Are you here? Can we meet somewhere close by? And you just don't have that luxury anymore. And on top of that, even though we are still in the briefings, we are still traveling, has been cut way back. And so the number of journalists who have a daily access to the president at a time when he is speaking every day to the public is hard, because obviously you want to be there, you want to represent CBS, you want to ask your questions, and only a handful of people can do that. And I absolutely agree with the policy that the White House Correspondents Association has put into place to really try to make it fair and, most importantly, safe for everybody. And I think one thing we forget sometimes, as we often do covering any story, is that we want to run to the story. We want to run toward danger. We want to run toward the action. And that's true in this case as well. But unlike those cases, we are just as vulnerable as everybody else who is doing that. And so, as you mentioned, I have my own family to think about. I have parents to think about. And so we're all experiencing this together. But certainly covering the White House and the politics, just the practical front is very hard. And I think it's amazing to see how we've done, how we've shuffled things around, and how we continue to do our best. But certainly it is new, and we're still adjusting even several months in.
No, it's incredible, and all of us are living the same story we are covering. One of the honest with in our conversation today is just what's happened in the past 24 hours. Elaine, Senator Kamala Harris, when she was announced yesterday, again, new pandemic, kind of not by text message and tweet, that she was Joe Biden's selection to be the first Black woman, but also notably the first Asian American of any gender to join a U.S. ticket. What do you think of that identity and the historic nature of it?
It's really been such an interesting conversation over the last 12, 24 hours or so. This pick really is pushed into the forefront, right? This question of identity. And oftentimes in the past, we'd heard about quote unquote identity politics used as sort of a smear with respect to the oversimplification in some respects of large, diverse groups of people. But we are having this national racial reckoning right now. And the questions are complex. And the conversations about how one identifies, I think, are so interesting. And when you look at it from this political lens, especially, to see how someone with this diverse background navigates those questions is just something we haven't seen before. So I am so interested to see how it is that Senator Harris does that. There's also the question of gender. This is something that we know from watching previous campaigns. The fact is, women, period, full stop, I think are judged with a different set of criteria, one could argue. And in the political arena, that would seem to be no different. So those are all things we're very mindful of. And, from my perspective, being able to have the time and space to have those more nuanced conversations is really critical, because I think that's what people are looking for right now. They want to have a better understanding of who it is that they may be voting for, who these folks are, what their backgrounds consist of. This issue of identity, I think, is sort of at the forefront in a way that maybe it hadn't been in the past.
The media gets criticized for also is sometimes over focused on the newness of something, on the label to apply to things. And the choice of language is complicated, it's personal, it's political. And Joe Biden got all this press up publicly in letters that were issued pressuring him not just to select a woman, which he said he would do going all the way back, to pick a woman of color, specifically a Black woman. Do you think that, how do you navigate that in your coverage? And do you think that the focus on the role in any way detracts from the qualifications of the candidate? Or should only focus on the first rather than to talk more about the candidate herself? How do we navigate this?
I think the difficulty is that we are in a place of this reckoning where these questions cannot be ignored. And it is part and parcel of the political landscape, again, in a way that it hadn't been. And so while I think it is important to focus on that, we also just have to keep in mind that a person's identity is not defined by one characteristics, not even two. As you pointed out, we're all mothers here, but we're journalists. We have multiple facets to our personalities. And so I think it's no different when you're evaluating a political candidate, but you're right, how we actually choose to discuss these characteristics, how much emphasis is placed, who it is that we choose to talk to get at that kind of question of identity. I think all of those factors need to be thought of in a more deliberate way, because it is important. People may be coming to us and getting a real education for the first time about what it means to have a multicultural background. So it's important to reflect on those bigger questions, especially now. Who are those voices that are being included at the table when these conversations about evaluating candidates are taking place?
And
when the news
since you
broke,
covered, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, when the news broke, I was watching you and, looking at some other breaking news as well, reading banners. And I thought it was, I was personally and professionally really happy that, when you talked about Kamala Harris, you talked about this historic moment because she is the first Black woman to be on a presidential ticket and the first Asian woman to be on a presidential ticket. And, that conversation is already brewing because a lot of media outlets omitted that second part. And, this is just another example of how tricky and challenging it is to talk about one's identity and to try to portray that in the most accurate way, because these two pieces of who she is are simply facts. And to call her a Black woman is not wrong. But, there's another community that is also celebrating this as a historic moment for America and for Asian Americans. And so I think that's something to watch as we move forward. And, there's already some tension that I've heard and read about when it comes to claiming somebody. And I think we just have to remember that at the end of the day, it is about her. It is about, her as a candidate and everything she brings to the table, which includes her entire background.
More about this. You're both very thoughtful on this. I'm told, though, that we have some technical difficulties, and so we have to take a moment to refresh something. I'll stick with us for just a moment. And I think we're back, Ouija and Elaine, if you can hear me.
You sound great.
Okay. Okay, I hear you, Ouija. Elaine, can you say something else for a moment? I am unable to hear Elaine.
Did not mute. Nope. Did not.
There you go.
Hello, hello.
See, this is the new reality we all live
That's
in.
right. That's right.
And we all accidentally keep the mute button on. That happened to me the other week with the Prime Minister of Australia, who kept the mute button on. And it's the first time I've ever had to tell a world leader, unmute yourself. So everyone does it. And all of us have this stumble out of the gate. We're learning as we go.
That's right.
But both of you were reflecting, I think, in a really thoughtful way about talking about identity in this political news cycle that we are in. Ouija, just to add to that, you covered the 2016 campaign, which was the last time we saw a female candidate at that time, the lead, not the second position on a ticket. What did you learn about that? And what do you think we as journalists have learned, if anything, about how to cover gender?
I learned that people spent a lot of time thinking about Hillary Clinton's suits. And that says so much more about the way people approached the campaign, approached her candidacy. And by the end of it, I think it was a meme, which was problematic because it was taking away from everything else that she was bringing to the table because people were so focused on the fact that she was a woman and wanted to know what she was wearing. And in fact, this morning, somebody wrote about Senator Harris's shoes and how she wears Converse sneakers. And so I think that it is a point that we can't make enough, that we try our best to not focus on the noise, and that certainly is noise. But at the same time, if these candidates want that to be part of the conversation and embrace their roles as mothers and grandmothers, that's different because they're the ones that are controlling that narrative. But, beyond that, I think I saw that it was challenging because you could see during debates, you could see during other events that, Secretary Clinton was doing her best, but would receive certain questions that always went back to the fact that she was a female candidate. And so I think, it is something that we continue to have to reflect on, especially because we're in this moment again. And the country is very different than when it was just 4 years ago. And so we have to think about how we can best serve potential voters and people at home who need the best information about that person outside of what they're wearing.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, I introduced the idea that both of you are mothers because I know that is part of your identity and you both talk about that. But do you think, because I certainly would say that also as women in television in a visible role, how you report, how you say things, how you appear obviously is part of that conversation. Elaine, how have you managed that when you went from being a White House correspondent into this anchor role? Do you think about this? Has that changed over time?
It's interesting because I think if anything, in this particular moment as a mom, there's a sense of urgency that because, as you pointed out, we are all living through this story of the pandemic. It feels very different than I think had I not been a mother at this time, because my concept of, being able to sort of simultaneously live in the moment, which is what kids do, but also envision 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now when these children are grown, that is a very different perspective that I think being a parent brings to this job of being a journalist. And so when there is some sort of policy pronouncement, you're looking at it, at least I do, from this perspective of, in the near term, what does this mean? But in 20 years, when children who are babies now are, in their adulthood, what will that look like for them? And so from that lens, I think that's how parenthood and motherhood have sort of affected me, because there is, as Weijia, I know, has said time and time again, these are real questions of life and death. And there is, like I said, this urgency, this immediacy that I think really has just been heightened because of the fact that I am a mother.
Mm-hmm. And Weijia, would you agree with that? I mean, you became a mother on this beat. You talked and shared, I think publicly, I was impressed about the logistics just of flying around the world and trying to deal with a newborn at the same time. How has that changed how you do your job?
Well, because I started this job while I was pregnant, I guess I've always had to try to balance these two things. And I'll share something that I think is important for younger journalists that I haven't really talked about, because everything sort of unfolded at once. Life happened very quickly in a matter of weeks. And I found out I was pregnant. And then a couple days later, the DC bureau chief called and asked if I wanted to fill in at the White House. And I frankly was crying, and they weren't tears of joy, because I was so stressed and thinking, wow, my personal goal and my professional goal, my dreams are colliding. And I was struggling, and it wasn't happiness. Like I said, it was this fierce pressure of thinking, this is the worst timing ever. And now, having gone through pregnancy and becoming a mother, I realize how ridiculous that is, because there's never going to be the right time to do that. And, I try to encourage younger women, especially, who have opened up to me and said that they feel that even to this day in 2020, they have to decide between one or the other. I try to stress that you don't. And it is very challenging, as you know too, Margaret, but it is doable, and you just make it work because you don't have a choice. But it was a choice to become a mom for me, and I was very grateful that I was able to do that. But like Elaine said, I think it shapes our view differently. It helps us report because it brings a new perspective, and changes the way we view the world. And so it has been challenging, but I think has enriched my reporting, has enriched my experience, and yeah, I think that overall, I mean, even though I was crying at the time, I wish I could go back and tell myself to stop doing that.
Now, you are telling that story, and I'm shaking my head. Yes, yes, that all happened to me, because I began the job I have now at the same time that I was pregnant. And you do have that panic of, oh my God, how am I going to do it all? And then how do I prove that me doing one of those things doesn't get in the way of the other, that I can do both?
Right.
And that is a tension that I think is unique too, because you as journalists want to be judged on the merit of your work. And being the pregnant TV host, being the pregnant White House correspondent, people see that. And they see that before they hear you. And I wonder how you thought about that, Weijia, because I was impressed that you embraced that and chronicled on Instagram, what it was like shipping breast milk around the world, which I was like, gosh, I had to figure that out too. But I wasn't brave enough to put that out there. And I was impressed you did that. Why did you do that?
I thought it was important to try to normalize all these aspects of motherhood that I think people still sometimes feel uncomfortable talking about. And, it is very personal, but I wanted to show that even though it is hard as hell, probably the hardest thing I've ever done, that I could do it. And if I could do it, then someone else who might need to hear it can see that they can do it as well. because growing up, it was such, I was so focused on my career and, getting the next job and staying on course that I could have easily abandoned my personal dreams too. I think because of my personality, I could easily see that. And now that I see the rewards of leaning into wanting to, be a wife and a mother and really embracing that, I feel very grateful. And it's something that I wanted to share. And it was hard. And I got a lot of mixed reaction, a lot of people saying that's TMI. We don't need to know that. But I think the majority of the response I got was just thank you. Thank you for sharing this deeply personal experience, not just because hearing someone's story, which was my story, but also logistically, just letting people know how to do it, because it's not easy shipping things from breast milk from Asia.
And Margaret,
No,
can I
it's not.
just add something as well?
I've done it.
Margaret, can I just add as well, through the years as I've been coming to AAJA, that is one of the biggest questions young people have had. This question of quote unquote balance is, how do you do it? Not necessarily the specifics of the logistics, but we just got that covered. But the idea of trying to focus in this intense way on one's career, while at the same time making sure that personally there is a sense of fulfillment. And I've always said that those folks who neglect one and neglect that personal side, you are a poorer journalist because of it. Because journalists, by definition, we are there to present the facts in a fulsome way, and a variation in life experience can only help with that. So I think there is tremendous interest in this. And Weijia, I can only imagine you got a tremendous response from that, because it was this time last year, Weijia. I remember you explaining this to me. And I just, like Margaret, I just thought, what is she talking about? There's a business that does that? I mean, it was remarkable. So I really applaud you, and you as well, Margaret, because it does, I think, speak volumes. It is in some ways, in many ways, a statement in and of itself. The fact that you are able to do both, even if it means sometimes it does feel overwhelming. I mean, we are human beings. And as I said before, we are multifaceted. So it's important that people understand that.
And another, I think, putting it out there is a service. So I applaud you both for doing that. Elaine, I want to talk a little bit about some of the stories that you have covered. But right now, I also want to remind our audience that you can participate in the conversation yourself. We will be taking questions. And to do that, you can submit your questions via the Pathable chat box, which should be on the right side of your screen. And we'll come to those later in the session. So as you're listening, and if you have a follow-up question that I didn't get to, pop it in there, and we will be able to put that to Elaine and to Weijia ahead in the conversation. Elaine, I do want to pick up on something, and I believe we have a clip of one of the stories that you worked on, which in some ways was personal for you. And this was a story that you did on Filipino healthcare workers. And as we've been talking about representation and how you think about race and representation, that goes beyond this moment, goes beyond this presidency. This was something personal for you, and I want to share it with our audience.
Recent surveys say Asian Americans are reporting increased harassment and discrimination during the pandemic. This comes as many work on the front lines caring for COVID-19 patients. For one group, the virus is taking an outsized toll on people of Filipino ancestry. They make up 1% of the U.S. population, but more than 7% of the nation's healthcare workforce. And according to ProPublica, 1 in 4 Filipino adults in the New York, New Jersey area works in the medical field. Elaine Quijano shows us how the community of caretakers is coping.
As my sister-in-law was saying, we could probably build a hospital or a clinic by ourselves.
From nurses to therapists to doctors, Nina Batayola jokes there are so many healthcare workers in her family, they could fully staff their own hospital. Nina and her husband, Don Ryan Batayola, left the Philippines in 2007 to work as occupational therapists in the U.S. Then, in early March, they found themselves on the front lines of the pandemic.
And then in late March, you started to get sick.
I finally called the emergency 911 on him. He couldn't even drink water anymore.
Days later, Don Ryan was well enough to FaceTime from the hospital.
We were very hopeful. He looked much better. He didn't like the food. So I said, like, okay, think what you wanted to eat, call me back, and I'll have it delivered. He never got to call me back. That was it.
On April 4th, Don Ryan Batayola passed away in New Jersey at age 40.
We thank you for welcoming Don to thy gates in heaven.
His family paid their respects in an online service.
You were missed while you were gone.
He's one of more than 50 Filipino healthcare workers who have died from COVID-19 in the New York, New Jersey area alone, according to ProPublica reporter Nina Martin.
In 1898, the Philippines, which had been a colony of Spain, became a territory of the United States. It became one of the places that the U.S. saw fit to exploit labor from. They basically created a workforce that has turned the Philippines into the largest exporter of nurses in the world.
Many Filipino-American healthcare professionals work at the bedside or in critical care, the kinds of jobs that make you most vulnerable in a pandemic. Filipino-American nurse Jem Scorp works in the ICU at Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, New York, once the epicenter of the epicenter.
Have you been there in some people's final moments?
Exactly. I have a COVID patient. The wife was calling. So, of course, nobody will touch the patient. So I told the wife, I'm not seeing my wife. I'm not seeing my son. So this husband of yours right now is my family.
For months, he stayed at a hotel so he could keep working without infecting his wife and son. Family reunions looked like this.
It must be so difficult. I can't imagine being separated.
It is. It's not easy. Emotionally, it is.
Nursing was Jem Scorp's path to the American dream. For Nina Batayola and her two children, Erica and Enrico, that dream endures.
Even in this painful moment, do you see an American dream for them?
Yes. Yes. I have dream for them. It might not be the same American dream that I had before.
Don Ryan Batayola loved sneakers, Bob Marley, and of course his family. Nina and Don Ryan had just attained part of their American dream. They both became U.S. citizens last year. And Gail, as an American of Filipino descent, the story reminds me of my aunt, my Tita Butz. She is a nurse in the Chicago area. And for her and so many other healthcare workers of all backgrounds, it's really a calling to risk your own health each day to help strangers in need. And Gail, I've heard you say it time and time again on CBS this morning, we are all so grateful to all of them.
We really are. I mean, these are truly the frontline people. And I was thinking, when you think about the Filipino culture, is it very common that people want to go into the medical profession, Elaine?
It is. It really is. And there's also this sense of hospitality, which is very much part of the culture as well. One thing that you'll hear people talk about is that they always have a smile on their faces when they walk into a patient's room, because to them, that patient, and especially in this time of COVID, with no family able to visit, that patient becomes their family. So this idea of hospitality, of family, of caregiving, is really part and parcel of the Filipino culture.
Was it something you ever thought about? Did you ever? I'm glad you didn't, but did you ever think about it?
I was supposed to. There are certain tracks that you are highly encouraged to follow. I'm the child of Filipino immigrants, and nurses, doctors, healthcare workers, engineers, those are all those tracks, but I took a different path. But we're so grateful. Again,
I'm glad you're with us.
My Tita Butz, I know a lot of family members overseas as well. I have relatives who are doctors and nurses who are battling COVID-19 each and every day as well. So it's really, truly a cultural kind of experience, and they very much are on the front lines.
I'm so glad you're with us, Elaine. And the thing that stuck out to me, what you just said about going into someone's room and smiling, and just to give a little bit of human connection, because the thing that scares me so much about this and touches me is that someone is there alone and surrounded by no one who knows them and cares about them. Just to have somebody that smiles and looks at you and really cares makes such a difference, especially during these times. Elaine Quijano, thank you so much. Always good to see you.
Elaine, why did you want to tell that story?
You know, so I had learned about the statistic, Nina Martin's story there with ProPublica. And in the New York, New Jersey area, the fact that you had nearly one out of every 4 Filipino adults involved in the healthcare field, as we were having this conversation about COVID-19, I hadn't seen those voices represented. And I felt very strongly, given the fact that I do have ties to healthcare workers, as I mentioned, my aunt, my Tita Boots, who's in Chicago, but I could very much place myself in the shoes of those who were going in and day out and not necessarily able to be heard in this conversation about the pandemic. And so I felt that this was a story that I could understand, not just that experience of being a relative of a healthcare worker, but also the larger history. There is context, as we heard. The United States, after the Spanish-American War was ceded, or the Philippines rather, was ceded to the United States. So there is a long-standing sort of pipeline that has been in existence of Filipino labor to the United States. And in this instance, in the healthcare industry especially, we didn't have time to get into it in the piece, but there is an idea that without this workforce, the healthcare industry in the United States would really be in dire straits with respect to staffing. And so all of these factors kind of contributed to wanting to pursue that story. And again, just pause for a moment and hear from some of these voices that we just hadn't heard until this point about the COVID story.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know, Weijia, you have also chosen to take a bit of a step out of your White House role, and you told a personal story as well for CBS this morning when you did a feature on the hotel and restaurant industry and racism against people. What drove you to do that, to take a step out of your very busy day job to tell this story?
So when I first heard members of the administration, including President Trump, using the term China virus, Wuhan flu, et cetera, to describe COVID-19, I quickly realized that there was going to be a lot of misplaced anger and misconceptions. And sure enough, there were reports every day of more attacks on people in this country who are Asian American, just because of the way that they look. And I wanted to tell their stories and see how it was impacting them, because even in New York City, you know, arguably the most diverse city in the country, there were business owners who were really feeling discrimination because they felt that people were worried about, coming to their businesses. In other parts of the country and world, we were seeing people being turned away from hotels. We were hearing about school children being bullied. And that was very personal for me because I grew up in West Virginia, which was not easy for a variety of reasons, but partly because I, received a lot of racist rhetoric and attacks. And so I just wanted to highlight what was happening for the Asian American community and to try to dispel some of the misconceptions, again, leaning on facts. And the CDC had even come out already and said, an Asian American person is not more likely to transmit the disease than somebody else. And so those are facts that unfortunately some people did not know and still to this day don't understand. And that does lead to bias against Asians.
Mm-hmm. And you had also before, I know last night you spoke publicly at AAGA about your very public exchange with the president about at a press conference when he told you to go ask China. But before that, even, you had started talking in your role at the White House about some of what you were seeing as personally troubling to you. And I remember distinctly you sent a tweet a few weeks before that, and you said, this morning, a White House official referred to coronavirus as the quote unquote Kung flu to my face. Makes me wonder what they're calling it behind my back. What were you thinking? Why did you send that tweet? Why did you think that needed to be public?
You know, it had just happened and I was still kind of reeling from it, because when you go and have conversations with sources, you do not expect to hear something like that. And I thought it was important because it sort of showed the ease at which members of the administration, people in official roles who represent all Americans, had to in calling the coronavirus something that could be really harmful. Because it's that sort of language that leads to these, misconceptions and leads to incidents where people are being attacked. And I couldn't help but think of my, older parents who are in West Virginia and how, this might come up and someone might shout this at them. And so it wasn't, I don't think the word expose is necessarily right, but I did think it was important to just sort of reveal the way that administration officials were talking about it almost in jest. And by the way, fast forward several months later, the president used that phrase a few times at rallies to talk about COVID-19. And at that time, I felt a little bit of vindication, because people were questioning whether my tweet was accurate because I didn't name the official. But, I am a journalist too. And if a conversation is off the record, you really have to grapple with whether you're going to respect those boundaries, even if someone says something like that. And so because I did not reveal the name, people questioned whether it was true, because certainly nobody would possibly say something like that. And then the president himself did it in public.
And I think we have an exchange that you had with the White House spokesperson about it. Let's play that.
I have a question of my own. Last July, President Trump declared himself the least racist person there is anywhere in the world. Why does he use racist phrases like the Kung flu?
The president doesn't. What the president does do is point to the fact that the origin of the virus is China. It's a fair thing to point out as China tries to ridiculously rewrite history, ridiculously blame the coronavirus on American soldiers. This is what China's trying to do. And what President Trump is saying, no, China, I will label this virus for its place of origin.
That's what he's saying by using the racist phrase Kung flu?
He is linking it to its place of origin.
What does he have to say to Asian Americans who are deeply offended and worried that his use will lead to further attacks of discrimination?
So the president has said very clearly it's important that we totally protect our Asian community in the U.S. and all around the world. They're amazing people, and the spreading of the virus is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. They're working closely with us to get rid of it. We will prevail together. It's very important. So it's not a discussion about Asian Americans, who the president values and prizes as citizens of this great country. It is an indictment of China for letting this virus get here. And I would also point out that the media blames President Trump for using the terms China virus and Wuhan virus when they themselves have used these very terms. The New York Times called it the Chinese coronavirus. virus, Reuters, the Chinese virus, CNN, the Chinese coronavirus on January 20th, Washington Post, January 21st, Chinese coronavirus, and I have more than a dozen other examples.
Category, Kayleigh. Kung flu is extremely offensive to many people in the Asian American community. To be clear, are you saying the White House does not believe it is racist?
To be clear, I think the media is trying to play games with the terminology of this virus, where the focus should be on the fact that China let this out of their country. The same phrase that the media roundly now condemns has been used by the media. I can go more examples. Wuhan virus, CNN said on January 22nd, and we can go on and on and on. So while the media wants to focus on nomenclature, the president's going to focus on action.
Yes. I just wanted to follow up very quickly on Leisha's question and Caitlin's follow-up. Does the president regret using the term Kung flu, regardless of the fact that media organizations, including my own, had early on described the virus as the Wuhan virus? That is a different thing than saying Kung flu. Does the president regret using that term?
The president never regrets putting the onus back on China, pointing out that China is responsible for this, and in the process standing up for U.S. troops who are being blamed by China in a campaign of misinformation.
And on
Leisha, what was that like for you?
Well, I think every time you have a chance to ask questions of administration officials, afterward you sort of do a debrief with yourself and you wish you had asked certain questions. The one question I wish I had asked is how that phrase actually, does what Kayleigh McEnany had claimed, which was link it back to its origin. So I should have asked, if you could walk me through the logic of how Kung flu does that, because it doesn't refer to a place, unlike China virus or Wuhan. But aside from that, in the moment, I just felt it was really important not to follow up, to continue following up, to try to get some clarity, because she was defending the president's use without really addressing the fact that he did say it. And I think the takeaway from that particular briefing was that you don't have to be a person of color to ask questions about something that impacts the community of color when we're at the end of the day talking about how it impacts Americans. And it wasn't just me. After that, 2 white female reporters followed up. A Black female reporter also did. So here you have a group of journalists who are just trying to get an answer about why the president thinks it's appropriate to use this language. And so I think that speaks to the camaraderie of the press corps that is also really important to highlight, because even though we all have our own lists of questions that we want to ask, it's really important to listen during those briefings and to take note of questions that have not been answered. And if you have an opportunity to follow up for a colleague, and you really think that, that answer needs to be told, then you really should do that.
Mm-hmm. And that doesn't always happen. So it is remarkable when it does, as you just pointed out, in that circumstance. Elaine, I'm wondering what you are thinking about this, as an anchor, and when you anchor Red and Blue, how you talk about language and how Kayleigh characterized it, which was different, which was about a specific justification having to do with point of origin. How did you navigate that in your anchoring?
So it's interesting. I mean, we do have the luxury of time, so we can let those exchanges play out fully in a way that allows the viewer a more complete picture of the response and the thinking, the reason behind the response and the follow-up. And I think, the statements there speak for themselves, and we just continued follow-up questioning to try and get some clarity. I think packaged together, viewers can make their own decisions about whether or not something is inherently racist. But I think what I reflect on when I saw that originally, I did a story not long after about how on the 4th of July, an Asian American family that was out for the first time since the pandemic to celebrate, in fact, the wife's birthday, who was born on the 4th of July, this was out in California, was accosted by a man who verbally basically told them to get out. And his exact quote, part of it was, quote, "Trump's gonna expletive you. You expletive need to leave. You expletive Asian piece of expletive." So when we talk about words having an effect, having a consequence, I got a lot of pushback from folks on social media who said, "Oh, you're saying it's the president's fault." And what critics have argued is that the kind of rhetoric that is deployed from the presidential podium can sometimes give people a feeling of tacit permission to express racist thoughts and beliefs. And not only just express those thoughts and beliefs, but to act on them, as this tech CEO, a white man, did on the 4th of July in that restaurant in California. I did that story for CBS this morning. I think it's so critical that people like Ouija continue to ask these questions, and that news organizations like CBS News continue to highlight when there are these incidents that happen, but also to broaden out that picture, to do stories like the nurses' story, like the healthcare story that we talked about a moment ago, because it provides a more fulsome picture of the facts. And it approaches the issue, I think, in a way that can be a bit more accessible. Because anytime you deploy that word, the R word, it automatically provokes a reaction. And it can be a defensive reaction that doesn't allow people to fully understand and absorb the pain that those words can inflict. So that's what I think about. It's not just looking at it, tackling it from one perspective. It's about bringing a multitude of storytelling devices to allow people to understand that words have power.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, for the two of you, separating the Asian American experience and then putting it in the context of what's happening with the United States and China geopolitically. These issues, you heard them conflated in some way from the White House podium. But I wonder what you think about where our country is generally with this, because this is not simply a President Trump phenomenon. In fact, if you look at Pew Research, when you look at the tension between the US and China, it has only been growing. And for both political campaigns, for both parties, it polls very well. The Pew Research Center survey said 73% of US adults say they have an unfavorable view of the country. That's up 26% since 2018. 1 in 4 describe China as an enemy of the United States, almost double the share who said this when the question was last asked in 2012. And the list goes on and on. Joe Biden goes out there, he calls Xi Jinping a thug. President Trump has only increased not only his rhetoric, but the administration's policies, Ouija, you know this very well, just have really ramped up in the past few weeks against China on multiple fronts. Mm-hmm. How do you think of where we are as a country with directionally the tension between these two powers and what this will mean for our language, for Asian Americans, and for our politics domestically? How do you think of this?
I think that the relationship between these two countries we're watching it spiral, and it has become so fractured, even more so. And we have to remember that it is a relatively young relationship. I mean, we're coming up on 50 years when President Nixon essentially, reopened the diplomatic ties between China and the US. And that is not that long. And during that time, while there have certainly been advances, there's always been this tension. And, I think that the timing for the pandemic could not have been worse because we were actually making progress. The president had just touted, and rightfully so, a massive trade deal with China. And that was going to be, a major victory for him. And now we're seeing that crumble as well, because China is not fulfilling its duties so far in that phase 1. And we don't know about the status of phase 2, which pretty much is dead when you talk to administration officials and even the president. And so that was supposed to be a big shift and a big turn. And then the pandemic arrived. And with that, as you mentioned, so many policy changes that are really highlighting where we're going together and where we're not going together. And so I do worry for the Chinese American community, for the Asian American community, as that relationship, frays even more. Again, the misplaced anger that people might have against Beijing, being thrown at Americans who might not have even been to China before, who might have been born here. And so I think, it's not an exaggeration to say that it is an extremely vulnerable position for both countries as we try to see, the next moves.
In your reporting, what language do you choose to do to hopefully avoid having people conflate? You talked about what President Trump does with throwing various terms just specifically at the virus. When you listen to the Secretary of State, he also uses naming of the virus in particular, but also how he refers to Chinese leadership. He picks and chooses his phrases, and he often refers to the Chinese Communist Party, communists. In your reporting, how do you carefully choose language that doesn't do the thing you're worried could happen, with people misinterpreting or conflating tension between two geopolitical powers and Asian Americans?
I think you have to just be so careful with your writing and to get feedback from those who are working with you. And also to attribute extremely carefully who is saying this and exactly what they're saying, and letting them say it. I mean, if I don't need to, say it myself in a line, it's easier and it's fairer to just allow the person to speak for themselves, but then offer context in, framing whatever soundbite we choose. What that actually means and why this could be problematic. And so I think a lot of times too, we have to be careful not to highlight the noise and distraction, because when the president uses this language, for example, it is a strategy to deflect from all the other things that he does not want to talk about, which is how this country is handling the virus and, the missteps that he has taken along the way. And so I think while it is important to, highlight the language that can be harmful and try to offer clarity, at the end of the day, people want the facts about the virus itself, and they want to know, the things they need to make daily decisions. And we cannot allow that distraction to get in the way of what matters to everybody the most, which is the health and safety of their loved ones.
Absolutely agree. Elaine, in your coverage, how do you think about the language to describe these concepts that I'm laying out here? Just the collision course the two countries are on, and then avoiding any kind of blowback for Asian Americans that would not be warranted, but obviously are getting conflated, sometimes intentionally.
No, it's a really good question. I mean, I agree absolutely with everything that Weijia just laid out. And, as I said before, because these words matter and because they're so powerful, we try to be so extremely careful in that realm of attribution that we just talked about, making sure that people understand we are talking about the government of China. And sometimes during conversations, I will raise the question, even though I know the answer generally, that most times I'll ask, well, do we know how the Chinese people themselves feel about this? So as to delineate a separation between the actions of the government and the Chinese people themselves, so that, so that our viewers are at least reminded of the fact that we are not talking about a monolith here. And hopefully that helps to broaden the thinking when it comes to Asian Americans. So that is the way that we've tried to approach things. So we understand that, obviously, as you pointed out with the polling, this is something we are going to be hearing about in the next weeks and months ahead. But it is incumbent upon us, for those very reasons that you mentioned, given this highly charged environment that we're in right now, to be mindful of how words can be misinterpreted if we're not careful. So, we always are, as much as we can possibly be, attributing statements, attributing actions to government officials when we can do that, so that in these broader discussions, people don't come away with the notion that all Asian people are the same, that some way, somehow they're conflating it. You just have to be vigilant about that and repeating that over and over each time this topic comes up.
I agree. I think the thing we're not also saying is the incredible time constraints that television correspondents are put under when they're crafting, when you're told you have 1 minute to get everything in there. And that nuance is very sometimes hard to do, and context. And that is so much on our shoulders as correspondents and as anchors. And I know you're talking about feeling that responsibility, the both of you. To that end, I want to ask you, since we're about to start the Democratic Convention starting on Monday and our coverage of it, this is a question for both of you. It's a tweet that I saw just yesterday, posted by Congressman Ted Lieu. And he said, I want to get your reactions to this. Dear DNC, Asian Americans are the fastest increasing group in America, including in multiple swing states. The gross underrepresentation of Asian American speakers in the 4 days of the DNC convention is tone deaf and a slap in the face. Do both of you think that is fair criticism? What do you think of this? And given where we started this conversation, talking about Kamala Harris being South Asian, how do you think of what he said here?
I'll go first. I will say broadly, whether it's politics, whether it's any other field, diversity, if you look hard enough, and sometimes you don't need to look very hard at all, is always a challenge. And I think what we're seeing with this tweet, with this VP pick, is this now coming to a head in this particular arena, on the Democratic side, in a way that we hadn't seen it happen before. But I can tell you, just from my time, I was thinking about when Weijia was describing the atmosphere in the White House briefing room. It is a change from the time that I was covering the Bush administration. There was not as much diversity in that White House briefing room as there is now. And, people will say there's always room for improvement. So I think in many, for all the reasons that we've been talking about since this panel began, people happens. You don't know what someone else has gone through. And so it behooves organizations to have as many of those, a woman of color that will be there. And Representative Liu's comment there, I think, will really spark patience with folks to find out what the thinking was or is with respect to the lineups. Because these questions of identity, again, this is a fact. And should it be the only part of the conversation? Of course not. But it is part of it, and that cannot be denied.
Weijia, do you have thoughts on Congressman Liu?
Feeling like their voices, and as a main speaker, does raise questions for people in the community about whether they're being represented and heard, especially when you have Andrew Yang, who, you know, was a big part of the primaries and, you know, at some points viewed as a potential leading candidate. And I think when he was in the spotlight, you know, I can just tell you anecdotally that, you know, a lot of members of the Asian American community were extremely proud and felt like he was, you know, a voice for them. And the fact that he was not asked to speak, I think, you know, it does lead to a lot of questions about why. I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for your reflections. I know I'm getting a lot of questions popping up in the Google document I have here from all the people who've been listening to you. And I'll read some of these audience questions. First off, I have a question from Juju Chang, and this is for Weijia. She wonders how Weijia manages to keep her cool when going toe-to-toe with President Trump. How do you do it, Weijia?
Hi, Juju. Thanks for your question. Honestly, in that moment, there is so much more to think about than what the president might say to you, what he might call you, that, you know, you cannot take it personally because you have such a responsibility. When you think about how few people have the opportunity to ask questions of President Trump on behalf of Americans. And so I just have to stay focused. And I spend hours preparing for these briefings with my team, with the White House team. We workshop questions. We, you know, talk about, well, he'll probably say this because he's been asked a form of that question before. He might bring this up. So you really have to tweak every question and almost every word to try to get the best answer. And so I'm so focused on that and thinking about, you know, if he allows me to have a follow-up, what that would be, that I'm not thinking about those personal attacks. But of course, you have to maintain your composure regardless of who you are interviewing, because, you know, you are not part of it. You're just a vehicle to try to get the answer.
This is a question for Elaine. Rachel Ramirez, Rachel Ramirez sent it in. Do you think this story on Filipino caregivers and nurses and families disproportionately affected by the pandemic would have been aired had it not been for you or Filipino American representation in the newsroom? Can you talk more about how this is an example of why representation matters?
You know, it's a good question. I can tell you that the senior producer for that was also a Filipino American. And so there's an awareness of that background. I think it is an example where you have a perspective that enriches our understanding of this story in a way that allows you to pitch it perhaps in a different way. So, you know, it's fascinating because the reaction to that story was something that I had not expected. I was told later on that just on Facebook alone, there were something like 2 million views, which blows my mind. But that is an example where this community isn't necessarily visible in a way that I think other communities are. So yeah, did it make a difference? I think having those conversations very clearly about, hey, we're in the middle of this pandemic. These are voices that are part of this ongoing story. Let's take a moment to hear from them. And, you know, CBS This Morning, which I think has been such a leader with respect to these conversations about race, these really tough conversations, they obviously were open to it. So I think that's really important to have, not just me, but also in this more senior positions, folks who are receptive to that, folks who have had that different experience maybe than has been the case in newsrooms in the past. So, that's from my perspective. I think it is perhaps an example of that, but I don't think they would have necessarily not done the story. I think that there has been such an examination of the response to the pandemic. There's been such a thorough examination, and there continues to be a thorough examination of the role that healthcare workers continue to play. So, it's tough for me to say for sure. I don't know, but I don't think it hurt that I had the background that I have.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder to everyone listening and watching that you can submit questions via the Pathable chat box, which is on the right side of your screen. That's where I'm seeing these questions coming to us right now. And the next one is for both of you, and it might be slightly uncomfortable to answer. Heather Chin submits it. She writes, have you ever faced resistance from bosses or superiors to being so open and engaging with audiences in terms of not hiding your humanity? And if so, how did you navigate that? Weijia?
Quite honestly, no. And I think that's because our leadership at CBS is a diverse group of people, and we have representation. And I think, people bring their personal experiences to their work. And, it's very helpful to have that support because there's, especially recently, been an acknowledgement that objectivity is not necessarily the way that we shouldn't think about it the way that we might have several years ago, because we are not objective people. We come from all sorts of backgrounds. We are mothers. We come from different places in the country, and that adds to our views as well. And so what matters is, whether you're fair and balanced in your reporting, and whether or not you let who you are seep in. And obviously that is the last thing that we want to do, but that doesn't mean we cannot embrace who we are and allow that to make us better journalists.
Yeah, I haven't had that experience at all. In fact, it's almost been the opposite, because that piece that I did on the healthcare workers is a good example. At the end of that, when Gail asked me that question about, my own experience, and there's a big part of me that just is not comfortable with talking about myself in that way, because that's just not professionally how I, sort of grew up. The focus was on the story and other people, and it still is. However, what my bosses have, I think, kind of created now is this space where we can think about things in a different way, that if one's lived experience actually enriches another person's understanding of what that community may have been going through, that is part of the story. And so, it's been the opposite, actually. People after that, in fact, after that story aired, I got so many emails, including from our bosses, about, that was great. It was great to hear about that. I didn't know that. And, that in and of itself is validation, right? It is encouraging to hear that it made an impact in that way, because this is about bridging those gaps of understanding. And if sharing a bit of that helps with that, that is still within the sort of confines of what it means to be a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Question for you, Weijia, from Paul Chung. He says, as an immigrant, we are told just do the work and not to make waves. What's your family's reaction when they watch you going head to head with the current administration? Do they worry about you?
They do, because, all of my family, except for my parents, are still in China. And the way that we have the freedom and ability to question the president of the United States is a different world. to them. And so every day when I walk into the White House grounds and you see immediately the American flag, I think about it and I look at it and I'm grateful for having this huge opportunity and responsibility, really. And they do worry, though, because, some of the exchanges have been heated, and they worry if that will lead to some sort of retaliation. But, again, because of where I grew up and because of the freedoms that we have here as journalists, it's something that we cannot take for granted ever. And it's something I do reflect on a lot, especially these days. And so I think they're also very proud, and, because never in my parents' wildest dreams, they have told me, did they think that they could turn on the television and see their daughter standing in front of the White House reporting about the administration. So I think that, again, it's something really personal to me and something that I think about a lot.
For both of you, and this is an interesting question from Nandita Godbol. She writes, does your political coverage and high visibility impact how you are seen as a parent in parenting circles? And are you judged for it? I think all of us are always judging ourselves in our own minds, but as parents and in our work life and personal lives. But do you feel that specifically because of our job? I mean, we're all showing up for work at a time when a lot of people don't dare leave their homes. So, even in this pandemic, suppose it adds a certain pressure. Do either of you want to take that?
I would just say because of the pandemic, I've had a really, I think, unique experience in those mom circles and those parenting circles because they don't really exist. Margaret's son and my daughter, Frankie, they go to the same music class and they haven't been able to do that. And I haven't been able to interact with other parents in the same way that I would if we weren't going through this. So unfortunately, I actually don't have that support system that I might have if we were able to socialize. But definitely, our neighbors have get-togethers that are socially distant, of course. And I think people, at least in my experience, try to put some space between what we do and how we're living our lives, chasing my 20-month-old around. And, people have been really hesitant to ask. Of course, they're curious, but I think they're really respectful too, that, we also try to compartmentalize and leave work at work and home at home.
Yeah, Weijia, you brought up the word that I was going to say, which is compartmentalization. I feel like in addition to being a multitasker, right, when you're a working parent, you have to compartmentalize. And I feel like with the sort of circle of parents, for me, there is that same sense of, if we're talking about mom stuff, we're talking about mom stuff. And we all have very busy and interesting, other lives. But because our time is so limited, let's just go ahead and be moms together. So I feel like that hasn't seeped in that way that you might expect. And I think that's actually healthy because it allows you to have that experience of just sort of being a quote unquote, regular parent and not have to go through after having, had an arduous week or whatever of a very busy news cycle, having to go through all of that. I think that it allows you to kind of refocus, to have those moments and to have those places where you can just sort of have that aspect of yourself in a full way, so that when you come back to this spot in front of the camera, then you're able to kind of be fully refreshed and sort of more completely rested, mentally, emotionally, physically, for having had that kind of connection. So it's valuable. And I think all the parents that I'm thinking of, we all recognize that no matter what your profession, you need to be able to just sort of be a parent.
Mm-hmm. Elaine, we lost you for a second, but I think we could hear you throughout, and I think everyone can see and hear you again.
Okay, sorry about that.
But no, not your fault, but just to let you know, I think everyone heard everything you said. I know for me as a parent, I do feel like I have to tell, I do go to an office, FYI, there is some risk associated with me because of that. And I think all of us have to figure this out in the year ahead, how to manage it. So it's an interesting question. This question is from Bobby Calvin for Elaine. How much pushback did you get from your immigrant parents when you decided to become a journalist?
Yeah,
you're
so
laughing.
I was originally supposed to actually be an engineer because that was just the track that was sort of most readily apparent to me at that time when I was coming out of high school. And so I started off as an engineering major at the University of Illinois, which is a fantastic engineering school, but then quickly realized like, this is on another level. And so I shifted over to this just by chance, Intro to Broadcast Journalism class, and sort of, that propelled me into this world of broadcast. But when I told my parents that I was interested in that, it was like, what are you talking about? This is not a career track that was known to them, right? Again, these are immigrants from the Philippines who have a very clear sense of the paths that have been laid out before them. And so, they couldn't turn on the TV and say, oh, you're going to be like so-and-so. There wasn't really that for me and for them. So when I told them, to their credit, my dad actually was the one who said, okay, I don't really understand what this means, but, just tell me what you need. And he was the one who actually drove me to internships because I didn't have a car, and got me that ability to go ahead and get some experience as an undergrad that, then allows you to kind of stepstone your way through other jobs. But had he not been open to that, I don't know, because that support was really critical at a time when I knew nothing about the business. There was no network of support for people who looked like me, at least none that were visible at the time, which is why I think, AAJA, this is so important to have a place where you can call upon folks who have been in those positions, who remember what that was like, to look around and go, well, how does this work? Because I didn't have that. And so, there was definitely this sense of, I think at family gatherings, like, what is she doing now? And people would kind of look at me and kind of murmur, and I knew they were talking about me and they weren't quite sure yet what it was going to amount to. But I'll never forget when I first joined CNN and my grandmother in the Philippines saw me, because of course CNN is seen worldwide. That was a moment where it hit home for all of my family. Oh, that's what she's doing. That's what that's about, being a journalist, because it just was not a tangible prospect for them. It never was. So so it was surprise, I think confusion, but ultimately support. And that's really what mattered.
She must have been very proud of you when she saw you.
Incredibly.
Weijia, this gets at this gets at something I brought up earlier, the shortness of time for stories. Caitlin Lee writes, I'm a student member of AAJA and was wondering, how do you navigate and include all the nuances and context of a story when given a short time?
You can't. And that is unfortunate because we would all love, and we do beg our producers for more time. And sometimes you can't do that. And so we have to be really picky and choosy about what threads we are going to include in a story. And if we choose to if we choose to go down a path and something else has to go because of it, that's okay. Because, I do not want to just put in several nuggets for the sake of covering a lot of different topics. I would rather decide and have a conversation about what the most important threads are for the day and for that piece, and be able to expand on those and let the rest go. And sometimes you just have to let go and realize that you can't put it all in there, because it's not about, having bullet points. It's not about giving the most information. It's about giving the best information and the most accurate, important information. So I do remember, especially when I was younger, wanting to just have a kitchen sink piece every day. And you learn that you have to be choosy.
Mm-hmm. And then call and say, give me more time when you're talking to the producer.
Right. Exactly.
Last question for both of you is on mentorship from Anam Sadiq. Sometimes mentorship looks like people lifting people who look like them. How did you find mentorship coming up? Did you have mentors, Elaine and Weijia?
Yeah, you know what? I did, and they did not always look like me. And it's interesting because I can remember going to AAJA, in fact, in my 20s, many, many years ago, and finding folks there who I think, I'm thinking of, Cindy Hsu, who is at WCBS, the idea that there was a group of folks who were willing to open up and offer their collective sort of experience and knowledge and accrued wisdom over the years meant so much. But beyond organizations dedicated to helping younger journalists like AAJA, even in newsrooms, right? That I would not have necessarily expected folks to kind of approach me. I've just been lucky, I think, in that sense, where I have been able to reach out to folks, or sometimes unsolicited folks have approached me and said they very much wanted to reach out to tell me this or that, and if I ever needed anything, to please feel free and reach out. And so, I've tried to take advantage of those opportunities to get counsel from folks of different backgrounds, because I do think there is so much to offer. And oftentimes it comes from the most unexpected places. But I've just been lucky by virtue, I think, of being in a place, this is the thing about CBS News too, there is this sort of sense of, I think, at least in my experience, sort of fostering that connection with other reporters and correspondents and journalists. In New York, our offices are all there, sort of reporters row. And many, many times I can think of people just coming in to sit down and just have a chat about, how are you doing? How are things going?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that, you've been working on? Tell me. And I've so appreciated that. And that's meant so much. So it's a matter of, I think, not being afraid to reach out when that hand is extended to you, because like someone said earlier in the panel, I was raised very much in that sort of traditional way of, as an Asian American, put your head down, do your work, don't make waves. And as I think a result of that, sometimes you can miss those opportunities that are right there before you.
Mm-hmm. And Weijia, I will let you have the final thought on that.
I didn't join AAJA until very late in my career. And then I realized how much I had been missing out. But along the way, in my various newsrooms, I did have mentors and people who were willing to, help me improve my work. And I think that it's also the job of the mentee to identify people who you would like to get advice from because you admire their work. And I would just say, don't be afraid to engage and don't be afraid to try to start that relationship, because you are a journalist and you should have a lot of questions. And don't, that's why we have colleagues that are, sitting right next to us. Don't be afraid to ask those questions and to ask for help. And to Elaine's point, I was exactly the same way. And I touched on this a little bit last night, but I always assumed that if I just did the work, that's all it would take. And unfortunately, that's not true. I mean, you have to be an advocate for yourself, and you have to find people who might be an advocate on your behalf to show your work. Because if the right people aren't seeing it, then it doesn't matter what you're doing. And that is really tough for anybody to say, hey, look at me, when we don't want to be the focus. But when it comes to your professional goals, that is something that I encourage you to try to do, because again, it's not going to speak for itself always.
Weijia and Elaine, thank you so much for such a thoughtful conversation, and thank you to everyone at AAGA for putting this on and for making it happen despite all the technical challenges of working remotely. And I want to say a special thank you to Ann Sue from Team Face the Nation for all of her work on this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. Wow, what a tremendous